Chris Johnson always knew she wanted to serve her country and meet the right partner to serve beside.
You know, he was the epitome of duty, honor, country. Somebody you can trust.
Chris and Jim were going to have an absolutely wonderful life together.
What if the person you believed in most betrayed you?
You know, my gut kept saying something was off.
What if they'd betrayed everybody?
He could do whatever the hell he wanted.
He knew that he's possibly facing a court-martial.
Taking a stand could cost everything.
She was put in a real terrible situation and had to make some hard choices.
I just feared everything.
I couldn't believe that Colonel Johnson would do this.
Because I'm the one that blew the whistle.
That's when everything started to blow up, actually.
I fled. I didn't know at that point what he was capable of. So, the young me, wow. As a kid, I was a tomboy. I was always a competitive athlete. In my teen years, I was in beauty pageants, and I was Miss New York Teenager. The Army always attracted me. And then in college, I decided to join Army or ROTC.
Chris is thriving in college. There's only one drawback.
Mount St. Mary was almost, at that time, almost all women.
Just 9 miles south on the banks of the Hudson River is another college. This one, almost all men.
West Point United States Military Academy is the place where serious cadets go to become career or professional officers.
On Halloween night in 1985, Chris and her girlfriends make an impromptu visit.
We went trick-or-treating in the barracks at West Point. You know, we weren't supposed to be there, but here we were, and Jim was the cadet company commander, and I had dressed up as a baby, and so I had a baby bottle and a blanket. Jim was sitting at his desk studying, trying to ignore what was going on around him. You could tell he was so uncomfortable having this group of giggling girls, and they're all dressed in goofy costumes. I remember going over and just talking to him. I was like, wow, this is really, this guy, you know, this guy really has his stuff together. I made chocolate chip cookies, and Jim made a point of returning the tin to me. And he said, you know, they were the best chocolate chip cookies I ever had. And they say, you know, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I guess that might have been true a little bit, so. We met at the beginning of my junior year, the beginning of his senior year, and by the end of the year, you know, we just both knew that this is somebody we want to spend the rest of our lives with. You know, he was the epitome of duty, honor, country. That's something you want to be around. I mean, that's the kind of person you want to trust and build a life with. Somebody you can trust. His father was a general, and he was stationed in the Pentagon. Lieutenant General James Houston Johnson. They were known sort of as Fort Bragg airborne royalty.
After graduation, Jim continues officers training, while Chris goes to ROTC Airborne School.
At that time, not a lot of women went through airborne school, and I was the only woman in my chalk. At the final graduation jump, he pinned my wings on, and the wings he gave me were the ones his father pinned onto him when he graduated from airborne school. You know, I just thought that that was really special. The day after that, it was a weekend, and I remember him saying, I'm gonna fix us a nice breakfast. The table was set for breakfast, and there was a bouquet of a dozen roses. And he got down on one knee and put the ring on me and asked me to marry him. So it was very romantic and very sweet. We got married on May 17th, 1987. I remember friends saying, I've never seen someone walk down the aisle so confident. Just felt so right.
When they come out of the church, they have the saber bearers who form an arch.
Two people in the front put the sabers down and cross and say, you know, you can only pass with a kiss. So of course the bride and groom have to kiss in front of everybody.
Right from the beginning, Chris understood that, you know, Jim would be in command, but Chris would be the commander's wife. Chris embraced that.
Chris puts her own military career on hold, and she and Jim raise 2 children while moving from base to base.
I got involved in the community, learned the skill of being an Army wife and supported the career.
Army team couples is what we would call them. When they work well together, there's a halo effect.
We were a really awesome team, and they were building him to take on more advanced senior leadership roles.
Truly a great day to be here at Fort Benning, the home of the infantry.
Yeah, we had a happy marriage and happy family. We had a great life.
Jim's career is on the rise, at a time when the U.S. military needs more good leaders.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
He deployed to Afghanistan with the 82nd. They were a rapid deployment force. Jim got promoted to lieutenant colonel during that time. He came home the following year in 2003, was home for about 3 months, but he'd been selected to command a battalion. They were 101st Airborne Division in Iraq.
This will be a campaign unlike any other in history. A campaign characterized by shock, by surprise, and by the application of overwhelming force.
The children and I moved to Fort Campbell, Kentucky by ourselves because he had already left to go to Iraq. And in September 2005, he deployed again as a battalion commander. And I had concerns that he would be burnt out.
After being apart for almost 4 years, Jim finally returns home. It should be a happy reunion, but something's not right. He's cold and distant, even with his own children.
Jim changed during that deployment. Walking back from the soccer field for one of our children's games, he would just divert off and come back and show up 30 minutes later. Nothing I did was pleasing him. Nothing I did was good enough. All of a sudden, he's not initiating sex at all. So this is when the suspicion starts coming up. Something's not right. He's withdrawing from me. Intimacy is on a decline. What is up?
But then they receive the best possible news.
Jim was selected to command the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Italy, probably the most sought-after infantry brigade command in the United States Army.
We were very excited about it because we were all moving to Europe as a family.
In the summer of 2008, the family relocates to an idyllic residence in Vicenza.
We're finally all together in Europe, and it just didn't feel right. He started getting angry, and I started feeling like I was walking on eggshells around him. I'll never forget one day, too, during that time, he just looked at me and said, "Is this all there is?" Here, we'd worked so hard as a team to get to this, and it was hurtful.
By the end of the year, the relationship is even more strained.
Jim was always engaged with our family. We would do silly things like watch American Idol and all vote together, and he just didn't want to do those things. December 2008 was one of the most miserable Christmases I've ever had. Yeah. So many things weren't making sense. He was insistent that we were going to do a New Year's Eve party. I was worn out and thought, let's just enjoy the holidays as a family. We know you're going to deploy again next year. He said, oh, by the way, we're going to have this Iraqi family join us for this New Year's Eve weekend. And they were going to stay in the house with us.
Jim explains that he became acquainted with the Al-Attar family during his 2 tours in Iraq.
And that he said, there are interpreters. You understand that, right?
There's multiple interpreters at every level inside of a brigade operation. They are part of that same close-knit network for whom you would do almost anything.
I found out he's going to drive to the Netherlands and pick up this family 6 hours up, 6 hours back. And he doesn't have a vehicle big enough to fit them. So he's going to take a vehicle, a van, out of the motor pool, the brigade motor pool, a government-owned vehicle. And he's going to use it for personal reasons. That is a huge no-no. You don't do that. He would never be that kind of guy that would do that. You know, he didn't lie, cheat, or steal. You know, my gut kept saying something was off. And I couldn't put my finger on it.
Jim arrives home with his friends and presents Aladdin Alatar, his wife Shrek, and their 24-year-old daughter, Haveen.
I remember the father had a heavy mustache. The mother was kind of your frumpy housewife. And her daughter, she had long, dark hair, wore very dark makeup, and she had a young child.
For the first few moments, it seems like this could be a happy New Year's weekend after all. Until Jim does something subtle. Something only Chris, his wife of 20 years, would find shocking.
He scooped down and picked up the 14-month-old, and the child didn't flinch. Jim wasn't somebody that held other people's children, never scooped up a friend's child. It was woman's intuition. And right then and there, I realized that there's something about this family that's just not right. There was something going on here.
Chris is only about to discover the reason for her husband's distance.
In a very, very tiny community locked inside of Italy, there it's a patent place of the highest order. There's no secrets.
Jim had gone against everything that the Army and West Point had taught him.
He's doing way worse. He's self-destructing. And little did I know, it was just the very beginning.
He destroyed his family, destroyed his name. He lost everything.
Colonel Jim Johnson is acting completely out of character at the family's New Year's dinner, especially with his interpreter's 24-year-old daughter, Haveen.
I remember not being able to eat. Everything about this is off. They had their own little private corner down on the end of the table. Haveen had a digital camera in her hands, and Jim was messing with it. And it was the same camera I had been given for Christmas. And he had given her one too, exact thing. I really didn't know how to process it. You're just ingesting it and trying to take the next breath. Keep your composure, don't fall apart in front of these people. That night, and I asked him if, he was having an affair with her. And he said, no, her family would kill her or disown her. Not, I don't feel that way about her. And then I asked him, well, have you kissed her? And he said, yes, but not passionately. What the hell does that mean?
That weekend, Jim tells Chris he wants to take the Alatars shopping at the Army PX.
One of my children said, oh, yeah, we had to wait for Haveen to make her grand entrance down the stairs because we were all sitting around just waiting for her. And she was upstairs doing I don't know what. Haveen is gonna get shoes for the baby. And at one point, Jim's like, oh, I'm gonna go over here. You take Haveen up to the register and pay for what she wants. So she's got these shoes. And on the way to the register, she finds a cute little sweater for herself. She picks out shampoo and other things for herself, just loading up on whatever product she's looking for. And I'm like floored. The mother, she would go outside and smoke cigarettes. During that whole weekend, she would go out and smoke a cigarette and leave the butt on the ground. Who does that? I ended up cleaning 12 cigarette butts off the ground when they left.
When Jim makes the overnight trip to take the Alatars back to the Netherlands, Chris is left alone to wonder how much trouble her relationship is in.
But I didn't want to believe that he was having sex with her. I still didn't want to believe it. I went into his office when I opened the top drawer, and I saw a notepad. And he had written 3 columns: divorce now, divorce in 6 months, divorce a year from now. And he had plotted out which would be most advantageous to him. I just remember when I found that note, feeling like the blood had drained from my face. That weekend I not only cooked, but I remember running a load of laundry for them. I did my husband's mistress's laundry. Jim got home and I said, I found a note in your desk today. And I said, are you divorcing me? And he looked at me shocked. He said, well, I'm sorry you saw that. No. And then he said, well, is that what you want? I said, no, I don't want a divorce. I want us to work things out.
When you have an affair in the military, if it's discovered, it normally doesn't turn out well for you in your career, which is why there's always denial, which is why you double down on denial.
Jim denies the affair, but Chris remains dubious.
I knew that the child, Haveen's daughter, could not have been Jim's. He had a vasectomy in June 2000. I think she was born in like November 2007. It's not his child. I kept looking. And I don't know if I was still trying to look for something to prove myself wrong or just prove myself right. Well, I finally did. He has a black book, and in the back, he had all these secret email accounts. And that opened up, at that point, 3 years of emails that he had been communicating with Haveen. And some of them were so juvenile. Like, reading them were embarrassing. It was like he was a teenager, a horny teenager. Literally. One of the emails she wrote to him was like, I'm your little shaitan. That means devil in Arabic. That, yeah, I mean, you're a little shaitan, we make trouble all your life. Kissy, kissy. As the emails progressed between them, I started realizing certain things he was saying with her that corresponded with events in our life. Like him taking money out of one of our personal accounts. He had taken $10,000 and converted it to euro and gave it to her. My legs started shaking. I couldn't stop it. And I thought, screw this, I'm calling him. Woke him up and screamed in the phone, are you her? He can't deny he's having an affair. And of course he said, you're recording this call. Someone's listening in. He wouldn't answer the question. It then led to me insisting that we go to counseling to see the family life chaplain in Vicenza, because I was not about to give up. I was not going to throw the towel in. I thought, I'm going to fight for my marriage. Unfortunately, there's a fair amount of adultery in the Army. Chaplains are there to help preserve marriages. The chaplain gave us this book. The book was about adultery. I don't even remember the name of the book. I hated it. It just made me so angry. One page said, the person having the affair, it's not your fault. And he just grasped onto that. Like, look, it's not all my fault. It's your fault too that I'm doing this. You know, it allowed Jim to give himself permission to continue to blame me for his actions, which is insane.
If you're a psychologist, this is standard transference. It's transference of blame to somebody else so that you can feel good about yourself, and you build this case, and you actually begin to believe it.
Of course, now I look back and he lied even to this chaplain during our counseling. Not only did he not stop the affair, he continued it and got even more deeply involved. A credit card receipt from his work credit card came to our mail, and I opened it up, and there was charges on there that didn't make sense. He was using his government credit card for her VoIP account so they could communicate. He did not stop at all. So then I'm starting to walk around with this big, deep, dark secret. Because if word got out that he was having an affair, his career's over. You know, the Army doesn't tolerate adultery. And so I had this burden now. I'm like, now what do I do with this? You know, I'd invested everything in him. You know, our family was invested. Our children had sacrificed for him to do what his country called him to do. I believed in it. Our children believed in it.
Chris has a very strong sense of right and wrong, very strong morals.
Jim was about to go down to combat with these guys again. I thought that the disruption of having your commander taken out, I did not want to cause a disruption in the brigade. And I knew I had to dig up whatever strength I had to handle this with as much grace as I could and to protect Jim. protect him from himself at this point.
Despite the betrayal, Chris continues to put Jim's needs first. And so does Jim.
Jim called early November, how soon can you be ready for a trip? I was like, well, where am I going? And he said, I've gotten a plane ticket for you and you're going to leave Italy. The only way I can fix our marriage is for you not to be there when I come home. I want you gone. I didn't know at that point what he was capable of.
He knows how to plan, he knows how to execute, he knows how to do wargaming, action, reaction, counter-reaction. Revenge becomes very, very powerful.
Noted, I'm Colonel Jim Johnson, commander of the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team, stationed in...
Chris Johnson's husband is wielding his powers as an Army colonel to force her from their home in Vicenza, Italy.
In a normal press conference format.
He's kicking me out. Jim had also said on the phone call, I'm revoking your command sponsorship, which means I'm not allowed to stay in Europe as a family member. I'm gone. I can't stay.
It is very unique to see the brigade commander's wife return unless they choose to go home. Very, very odd.
I remember shaking. There was something in the tone of Jim's voice that scared me.
Jim is not only pushing Chris out, he's demanding she leave their children behind.
I didn't know at that point what he was capable of. He's the only Army brigade commander in all of Italy. No one questions you.
There was no way Chris would leave her children in a foreign country and come back to the States without them. No way.
I decided for my safety and my children's safety, we're just gonna leave. So I ran over to the school and withdrew the children. And then I got one-way plane tickets to leave Italy. I fled. I felt like I fled Italy. And I remember landing in JFK, meeting my parents, getting in the car. And I just remember looking out the window and thinking, now what? Now what do I do? I don't have a job. I have no money. I have nothing. Now what?
5 days later, Jim tracks Chris down at her parents' home.
Kept trying to call. He was calling my parents, and finally I just decided, okay, I'll answer the phone and tell him, stop harassing my mom and dad. I'm here. Our children are safe. My children were very angry with him because they knew about the affair. They met her. I mean, they spent a weekend with this woman that they knew their father was involved with.
Over the next 2 months, the battle over custody intensifies.
He had tried 2 emergency injunctions out of a court in Florida to get emergency custody, and were both denied. There was no cause for it.
In response, Jim initiates an obscure legal maneuver called the Hague Petition.
My understanding of the Hague Petition, he was claiming Chris had kidnapped the child and taken the child back to the United States against Jim's wishes, orders, permission.
Jim is desperate for custody.
He knows how to plan, he knows how to execute, he knows how to do wargaming, action, reaction, counter-reaction. Revenge becomes very, very powerful.
Chris is further stunned when she gets news from Vicenza.
By the end of December, I got a phone call from my neighbor, and she said, Chris, there's been a young woman with a child seen coming and going from your quarters in Vicenza. He had moved his mistress into our house with her kid.
Relationships with foreign nationals are always scrutinized. You're not allowed to have a foreign relationship without reporting that up through your security clearance. It is a security issue.
He just let her roll right in and sleep on my pillow and eat off my dishes. She was just gonna roll in and take the place of Chris Johnson. And it was at that point I realized no one's gonna stop him. He's blatant about the fact that he's having an affair.
Jim had gone against everything that the Army and West Point had taught him beyond the point of no return.
That's when I realized, okay, I need to do something. And I thought, that's it. I've got to let the commanding general know. It was a moral decision for me to just sit back and not say anything. How do you look yourself in the mirror? I sat at my parents' computer. I typed like 5 pages, and I disclosed the email accounts that Jim had, the email accounts that Haveen had that I knew she used to communicate with him, the dates that I knew he had been with her, the misuse of government resources, the cell phone, the government credit card, like all the things I knew about.
After receiving Chris's letter, the Army immediately starts an administrative investigation, known as a 15-6.
By February, the 15-6 then rolled into a criminal investigation.
Meanwhile, the battle over the Hague petition escalates.
Jim's contention was that I was kicked off post because I was a disruption. He and his father both wrote affidavits saying that I was this disruption on the Army post, and that's why I was kicked off post, and that I was ordered to leave our children behind. But he was just trying to find anything to make my life hell. Jim called once and said, I'm gonna send U.S. Marshals to the house and, you're gonna get arrested. And that lasted for about 2 months. I mean, it was scary because who deals with a Hague? I'm being, accused of kidnapping our children and across international borders. And, it was 2 months of hell. It was amazing feeling when the judge ruled in my favor. My attorneys cried, I cried. I mean, they were so relieved. Stress will do terrible things to your body. I started getting sick, like a pain, abdominal pain, and found out ultimately that I had a pre-malignant tumor the size of a grapefruit on the tail of my pancreas. I had surgery December of 2011, and it was a much more complicated surgery than they had anticipated, and I ended up in the hospital for a week. I got a phone call from the hospital the day after I came home, and they said, well, we've just tried putting your claim into the military health insurance, and they've denied it. You're not covered. You owe us $100,000.
It was devastating. It's not like she had a lot of money.
As a military spouse, Chris should be fully covered.
I couldn't drive. I was still on meds. I still, stitches and, still kind of a mess. And so my sister drove me to the ID card office on West Point. And I, sat down with a woman and handed her my ID card, and she pulled up the information on the computer and said, oh, well, you're divorced. I said, no, I'm not. She goes, yeah, on September 23rd, you got divorced. So they go ahead and shred my ID card, and I just lose it. I just start crying. I'm not divorced. But they knew immediately something fishy was up.
West Point's ID card office notifies the Army's Criminal Investigation Division.
They had alerted Army CID. Because of all that, that's when the Army decided to do a preliminary look to investigate.
I get a phone call from Paul Danley, and he introduces himself as the lead CID agent investigating my husband. And he says, here's what we found out. Jim filed divorce registration. I'm gonna scan a copy to you, and I want you to look at it. Your signature's on it. Can you tell me if you've ever seen it before?
That's when everything started to blow up, actually. And it appeared that the divorce decree, or whatever it was called, looked like it was just a copy of a marriage license from when he and Chris got married in New York, with some things changed.
Basically, he created his own certificate of divorce registration. But he forged my signature, made up a signature of clerk in Monroe, and signed his name.
He filed that with the military. Again, that's a crime.
He said, oh, and by the way, Jim and Haveen got married. On November 9th, they got married.
I couldn't believe that Colonel Johnson would do this. Fake a divorce decree, and then marry Haveen while he's still married to Chris Johnson.
My husband had committed bigamy. Bigamy. Every time I turned around, I thought, now what?
And then all of a sudden, we're getting calls from Vicenza saying, hey, you need to come here. They found a lot more information than what was in Chris Johnson's letter.
Colonel Jim Johnson, who was once committed to duty, honor, and country, has broken his oath in a startling way.
I mean, he committed bigamy. I remember just saying, I can't make this up. One of my children sent their dad an email later, and all it said was, how was the wedding? Was there cake?
It turns out that Jim has been on the radar of CID investigator Paul Danley for some time.
The whole thing started with a contract fraud investigation over in Afghanistan. The contracting office had alerted Army CID because there was a Colonel Johnson, that was raising a ruckus because his contractor wasn't getting paid. They were fairly low-level contracts. This is for cultural support services. They can understand why Colonel Johnson was berating them for not paying this contract when they had other, bigger issues going on. Water, feeding the troops, etc. And they said it was so bad that, it raised red flags. We thought the investigation was done, and out of the blue, Chris contacted me.
Chris provides the missing piece of the puzzle. The fact that the contractor in question is Jim's mistress's dad, Aladdin Alatar.
Why are you dating the contractor's daughter when you're paying her father? That's a big red flag.
So you got an Iraqi man advising on culture in Afghanistan. Apples, oranges, just didn't make sense.
Aladdin Alatar was actually living in The Hague in the Netherlands. He knew nothing about Afghanistan. So it raised just a lot of questions about why this contract was even signed.
Paul asks Chris to provide anything else she can. Emails, credit card statements, travel records.
They started putting the pieces together. So then when I said, by the way, he was also exchanging bank account information with Aladdin, they realized that there was way more to it. He was having an inappropriate relationship, among other things, fraud, misuse of government resources, the whole 9 yards.
Then we discovered that Colonel Johnson had given a phone to the Alatars, a government phone, I should say. And one of the bills came back, I think it was over $30,000 for a month, just for 1 month of cell phone usage.
But there's more. Investigators going through Jim's computer hard drive uncover questionable financial deals worth millions.
They'd found that Colonel Johnson had tried to have a almost $10 million contract let for windmills. The whole contract was spun up as being a way to get water to troops in remote posts, that they'd be able to produce their own water. So when I talked to the company rep for this windmill company, he explained that they wouldn't work in Afghanistan. Someone was trying to push through a contract, almost $10 million for these windmills that wouldn't work. Why are we doing this?
The money trail leads back to Jim and to Havin's father.
Aladdin Alatar had supposedly found these, or was working for this Dutch company that developed the windmills. If this contract had been signed, Aladdin would have got approximately $500,000 as a finder's fee. So that's a big flag. You get the same contractor, you're dating his daughter, and all of a sudden, he's gonna get $500,000.
Chris's information makes it possible for the Army to build a solid case on Jim's financial misdeeds. They also find blatant proof of Jim's adultery.
Jim and Haveen made a sex tape, and he kept it on his government computer. They found it on his hard drive.
The greatest disgrace is where and when the tryst was recorded.
He was in Iraq and not in Afghanistan with his brigade. His brigade just went off to war. He's supposed to be leading his soldiers, and instead he's screwing around with his mistress. He's not a leader.
Army investigators have learned all they need to know about Jim Johnson. They're ready to prosecute. Jim is arraigned on a total of 27 charges, with a maximum possible sentence of 54 years.
The charges range from adultery, bigamy, fraud, misuse of government resources, and conduct unbecoming of an officer.
The Army flies Chris to Germany to attend a trial her email helped trigger, and which could cost Jim and her everything.
When you're married, as long as I was to Jim, upon a divorce, you are eligible for up to half of the service member's military retirement. But if Jim's criminal behavior led to him being dismissed or incarcerated, those benefits would have been taken from him, and so then half of nothing would be nothing for me.
Jim's not going to be the only one that's going to be punished. Chris and the children are going to be punished as well.
Made my stomach churn.
Jim Johnson has not been shut down. Even in the midst of a court-martial, he's about to show his own family how destructive he can be.
Jim was going out of his way to do anything he could to cause Chris and their children pain.
It was just unbelievable. I was so hurt. I just blown away and numb.
I think it's horrible. I think that's the worst of it all.
On June 12, 2012, disgraced Army Colonel Jim Johnson gets his day in court, and Chris is there to watch over the proceedings every step of the way.
I remember one time him looking at me, just, if he could kill me with his eyes, he would have, because I'm the one that blew the whistle.
The original list of 27 charges has come down to 2 counts of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman by the time the trial starts.
He pled guilty to 15 charges. He had to plead guilty to adultery because they had a videotape of it.
I testified during the trial, testified for a couple days at least.
The prosecution presents an irrefutable case, thanks in part to the evidence Chris has provided them.
It seemed like the panel was getting close to, not only convicting him, but, giving him a sentence, involving some incarceration or maybe a dishonorable discharge from the military.
Jim's attorneys now put anyone willing to testify in defense of Jim on the stand, including Jim's father.
His father said, "My son is an honest man. My son's an honorable man. He's not a liar. My son's not a criminal." Dude, your son is a criminal. He just pled guilty to 15 charges, and now you're up on the witness stand saying, "My son's not a criminal." Really?
Both sides rest their case. It takes the jury only a few hours to reach their decision. Jim Johnson is convicted on 2 counts of conduct unbecoming of an officer. The Army pronounces his behavior to be of a nature to bring discredit upon the armed forces.
What happened to the guy that, embodied duty on our country? What happened to the man that, doesn't lie, cheat, or steal, and tolerate those who do?
Jim's sentencing hearing is one last chance to acknowledge the pain he's caused. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he uses the opportunity to plead with the court not to send him to jail, so he can care for his beloved Haveen.
He was talking about, allowing him to go back and save her and keep her from being deported. He also made a comment, he's like, "Haveen and her daughter are the center of my life." And one of my children behind me heard that and just started sobbing. Our children used to be the center of his life. His family, us, was the center of his life.
He destroyed the relationship with his children. He chose to do that. It's just, it's so sad.
5 years confinement or pay a $300,000 fine. That was his sentence. His father wrote a check for $300,000 and paid the fine. He could have gotten up to 54 years in prison. Instead, he walked out of the courtroom as a colonel with eagles still on his shoulders. Justice wasn't served.
Jim should have gone to jail for what he did. But if he did go to jail, Chris and the children would have been catastrophic for them.
Chris does finally divorce Jim Johnson, for real this time.
From what I understand, he's still with Haveen and her daughter. We have no communication. Our children are essentially estranged from him.
Chris and her kids get half of Jim's pension and benefits. She knows not everyone is as lucky.
There's no whistleblower protection for spouses. So you tolerate illegal and immoral behavior where you turn them in and you risk losing everything. And that's what led me into working on some legislation.
Chris amazes me. She fought for herself and she fought for her children, and now she's fighting for other families.
What we ultimately created was called the Family Served to Military Justice Reform Act. And what that would allow is if a service member commits misconduct, it allows the service to properly punish the lawbreaker without financial repercussions on the family. The benefits that the families also earn are protected. So that'll be my swan song from the Army. That'll be the last.
There is a moment, just before something goes wrong, when the world still feels ordinary. The music is still playing. Glasses still clink against each other. Laughter spills out onto the pavement, careless and bright, as if nothing could ever reach into a place like this and take something away. In the early hours of January 26, 1996, the streets of Claremont looked exactly like that kind of place. Safe. Predictable. The kind of neighborhood where parents didn't stay awake worrying, where young people walked alone under streetlights without looking over their shoulders. And standing beneath one of those streetlights, just outside the glow of a row of late-night venues, was an 18-year-old girl trying to get home. Sarah Spires held the phone receiver close to her ear, the coiled cord stretched tight as she leaned slightly into the booth. Her voice, if you could hear it, would sound normal at first. Maybe a little tired. Maybe just ready for the night to end. She had called for a ride. Someone was coming. She wasn't stranded. She wasn't alone. Not really. Around her, Claremont was still alive. A car drove past, slow enough for its headlights to sweep across her legs before disappearing down the street. A group of people exited a barn nearby, their voices overlapping, one of them laughing too loudly at something that had already stopped being funny. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. Somewhere closer, footsteps approached and then faded again. Everything was happening exactly as it should. Except for one detail that no one noticed. Someone else was there. Not obvious. Not standing too close. Not doing anything that would draw attention. Just present. Just another shape in the background of a night that would later be replayed over and over again in the minds of investigators, witnesses, and grieving families. Minutes passed. The kind of minutes that feel insignificant while they are happening. The kind of minutes that disappear without leaving a mark. Then the car arrived. It slowed. It pulled up to the curb. The engine idled. But Sarah wasn't there anymore. No dropped purse. No broken glass. No scream that anyone could remember hearing. No witness who could say, with certainty, I saw what happened. Just absence. And absence, in cases like this, is louder than anything. At first, it didn't feel like the beginning of something bigger. It felt like confusion. A misunderstanding. Maybe she had decided to walk. Maybe she had gotten into another car. Maybe she had gone back inside without anyone noticing. But as the hours stretched into morning, and the morning into something colder and more uncertain, that confusion began to harden into something else. Something that didn't have a name yet. In Perth, people weren't used to this kind of silence. Missing persons cases happened, of course, but they usually came with explanations. They came with patterns that made sense after a while. People left. People ran. People got lost and were eventually found. But this felt different from the beginning. Because there was no direction. No trail to follow. Just a single point in time where a young woman had been standing under a light and then she wasn't. Days turned into weeks. Posters appeared. Questions spread quietly through conversations at kitchen tables and over coffee counters. People began to say her name more carefully, as if speaking it too loudly might make something worse. Still, there were no answers. And then, slowly, something else began to shift. The way people looked at the night. It's difficult to pinpoint exactly when safety starts to unravel. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small, almost invisible changes. A longer glance at a stranger. A decision to walk in pairs instead of alone. A hesitation before stepping into the dark space between two streetlights. Claremont didn't change overnight. But something had been introduced into it. Something that didn't belong. A question. What if she didn't just disappear? What if someone took her? The thought was uncomfortable. It didn't fit the image people had of this place. But once it appeared, it didn't leave. And then, months later, it came back sharper. On June 9, 1996, another night unfolded in almost the same way. The same streets. The same glow from bar windows. The same casual rhythm of people moving through the early hours, thinking about nothing more serious than getting home or continuing the night somewhere else. And somewhere within that familiar scene was Jane Rimmer. 23 years old. Old enough to be cautious. Young enough to still trust the world she lived in. She had been out. She had been seen. There were moments, fragments, glimpses of her moving through the night. Enough to confirm that she was there, that she existed within the same ordinary frame that had once held Sarah. And then, just like before, she slipped out of it. But this time, the story didn't end in silence. Weeks later, far from the lights and the noise of Claremont, her body was found. The distance between those two places mattered. It told a story that no one wanted to hear. Because it meant movement. It meant intention. It meant that whoever had taken her had not acted in panic or impulse alone. There had been time. There had been control. And suddenly, the question that had once felt speculative began to solidify into something much more dangerous. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. There was someone out there who knew exactly what they were doing. After Jane was found, the atmosphere in Claremont changed in a way that could no longer be ignored. The laughter outside the bars still existed, but it didn't carry the same weight. It sounded thinner somehow, like it could be interrupted at any moment. People started watching each other more closely. Cars driving slowly past were no longer just cars. Strangers standing alone were no longer invisible. Every detail began to matter. And yet, even with all that attention, all that fear, all that heightened awareness, it happened again. March 15, 1997. Another night. Another woman. Another disappearance that fit too neatly into a pattern no one wanted to acknowledge. Kira Glennon was 27. She had a life that stretched forward, full of plans and routines and people who expected to see her again. She, too, was last seen in Claremont. She, too, vanished into a space that should have been safe. By the time her body was found, the city no longer needed convincing. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't bad luck. This was a series. And somewhere inside that realization was a deeper, more unsettling truth. The person responsible had been there all along. Not hiding in some distant, unreachable place. But moving through the same streets. Breathing the same air. Passing by the same people who would later sit in their homes and wonder if they had seen anything that could have made a difference. That's what made it unbearable. Not just the violence. Not just the loss. But the proximity. The idea that the line between normal life and something unthinkable wasn't as solid as everyone had believed. That it could be crossed quietly. Without warning. Without leaving anything behind except questions. And the questions didn't stop. Who was he? How did he choose? How long had he been watching before anyone noticed? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all, how many times had he stood under those same streetlights, blending into the ordinary, waiting for the exact moment when someone would become invisible? For years, there would be no answers. Just files that grew thicker. Interviews that led nowhere. Evidence that seemed almost enough but never quite complete. The kind of case that lingers. The kind that refuses to resolve itself. The kind that changes the way an entire city thinks about safety, about trust, about the simple act of walking home at night. Because long after the headlines fade, and long after the streets return to something that looks like normal, there's always that moment. That quiet, almost invisible moment. When someone stands alone under a streetlight. And somewhere in the back of their mind, whether they realize it or not, they wonder who else might be standing in the dark. Before the headlines, before the police reports and courtroom transcripts, before their names became tied together by something dark and irreversible, they were simply three women moving through ordinary lives, each one carrying her own rhythm, her own habits, her own quiet expectations about the future. To understand what was taken, you have to step back into those lives, not at the moment they disappeared, but in the small, unremarkable hours that came before. The mornings that began without urgency. The conversations that ended without knowing they would be the last. The fragments of normalcy that, in hindsight, feel almost unbearably fragile. Sarah Spires was 18, standing at that uncertain edge between adolescence and adulthood where everything still feels open, still undecided. There was a lightness to her, the kind that comes from believing there is time, time to make mistakes, time to figure things out, time to change direction if needed. People who knew her would later struggle to describe her without pausing, as if the words themselves couldn't quite hold the memory. They would talk about her smile, how it arrived easily, how it made other people relax without them even realizing why. They would remember the way she spoke, quick and warm, like someone who didn't overthink the act of being herself. She had plans, but not the kind that were rigid or mapped out in detail. More like possibilities. Paths she could take if she chose. At 18, that was enough. There was comfort in the idea that the future wasn't fixed yet. On the night she disappeared, nothing about her behavior suggested that she felt unsafe. There were no recorded moments of hesitation, no urgent messages, no sudden changes in tone that would later stand out as warning signs. She moved through the evening the way countless young people do, meeting friends, sharing drinks, stepping in and out of crowded spaces where the music blurs into the background and conversations overlap without needing to be fully heard. If you could freeze that night at any random point, you wouldn't see fear. You would see a young woman exactly where she expected to be, doing exactly what she intended to do. That's what makes the final image so difficult to reconcile. Not just because she vanished, but because there was no visible shift leading up to it. No moment where the atmosphere changed in a way anyone could clearly identify. It wasn't a slow descent into danger. It was a clean break. And from that point on, everything about her became defined by absence. No body to bring home. No place to visit. Just a space in the lives of the people who loved her that never closed, never healed in the way grief is supposed to. Her story doesn't end with discovery or resolution. It simply stops. Months later, when Jane Rimmer stepped into the same nightlife, the same streets, the same glow of Claremont after dark, she carried a different kind of presence. At 23, there was more structure to her life, more shape to her days. She worked. She had routines. There was a sense of direction, even if it wasn't fully settled. People described her as grounded. Not in a way that made her serious or distant, but in a way that made her steady. Reliable. Someone who showed up when she said she would, who remembered the details that mattered, who built connections that lasted beyond fleeting interactions. If Sarah represented possibility, Jane represented continuity. The idea that life wasn't just about what could happen, but about what you were already building, already becoming. On the night she disappeared, there were more fragments left behind. Sightings. Timelines. moments where she existed clearly within the awareness of others. She wasn't alone in the abstract sense. She was part of a shared environment, moving through it in ways that could be partially reconstructed later. And yet, even with that, there was still a gap. A space between the last confirmed moment and everything that followed, where something happened that no one could fully see. When her body was eventually found, it forced a shift, not just in the investigation, but in how people understood what they were dealing with. Jane was no longer missing. Her story had an ending, but it was an ending that raised more questions than it answered. Because now there was evidence that this wasn't just disappearance. It was something deliberate. Something that extended beyond a single moment of opportunity. And then there was Kira Glennon. At 27, she stood further along the path that Sarah had only just begun and Jane was actively shaping. There was a sense of establishment in her life, a clearer outline of who she was and where she fit. She had a career. She had relationships that had deepened over time. She had moved beyond the uncertainty of early adulthood into something more defined. People remembered her as thoughtful, composed, someone who carried herself with quiet confidence. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that doesn't need to. The kind that comes from knowing yourself well enough to move through the world without constantly questioning your place in it. Her presence wasn't loud, but it was steady. And that steadiness made what happened to her feel even more jarring. Because if someone like her, someone careful, aware, grounded, could disappear under those same conditions, then the pattern wasn't just about vulnerability. It was about opportunity. It was about someone who understood how to find it. On the night she vanished, there were again those familiar elements. The social setting. The movement between spaces. The gradual thinning of the crowd as the night edged toward morning. The assumption, shared by everyone present, that leaving was a simple act. That getting home was a formality. But somewhere between that assumption and reality, something intervened. Unlike the others, she was gone. When her body was found, the pattern was no longer something investigators could cautiously suggest. It was undeniable. 3 women. 3 lives interrupted in ways that echoed each other too closely to ignore. But reducing them to a pattern risks losing something essential. Because they were not interchangeable. They were not simply victims of the same offender. They were individuals, each with their own trajectory, their own relationships, their own versions of the future that never had the chance to unfold. Sarah, who never made it past the threshold of adulthood. Jane, who was in the process of building something stable and lasting. Kira, who had already begun to inhabit that stability and make it her own. Their differences matter because they highlight something important about the person who took them. This wasn't about a single type. It wasn't about a narrow set of characteristics. It was about access. About timing. About being able to move through the same environment they did, unnoticed and unremarkable, until the exact moment when that changed. For the families, the individuality of each woman never faded. It couldn't. Grief doesn't work that way. It doesn't compress people into categories or patterns. It holds on to the details, the specific way someone laughed, the habits that once felt insignificant, the routines that now feel sacred in their absence. A bedroom left untouched. A phone number that no longer rings. A birthday that arrives each year with a quiet weight attached to it. For Sarah's family, there is an added layer to that grief. The absence of a body creates a different kind of emptiness. There is no finality, no clear boundary between hope and acceptance. Just a question that never fully settles. Where is she? For Jane and Kira's families, there is at least a place to go, a point of connection that anchors their loss in something tangible. But even that comes with its own burden, the knowledge of what was done, the images that cannot be unseen once they are known. 3 different stories. 3 different endings. All tied together by a single thread that remained invisible for years. And in the center of that thread, an absence not just of answers, but of understanding. Because even as investigators worked to piece together timelines, to analyze evidence, to identify patterns, there was still something missing. A face. A motive that made sense. A moment where everything aligned into something clear and undeniable. Until that moment came, these women existed in a kind of suspended narrative. Not forgotten, but unresolved. Not silent, but unanswered. Their names were spoken, their stories told, their images shared. But always with that same underlying tension, the knowledge that the most important part of the story was still out there, hidden, waiting. And as time passed, the risk was not that they would be forgotten. It was that they would be remembered only for how their lives ended. Which is why it matters to return here, to this part of the story, where they are still fully themselves. Not defined by what was done to them, but by who they were before it happened. Because that is what was truly taken. Not just 3 lives, but 3 futures. 3 sets of possibilities that will never unfold. And a sense of safety that, once broken, would take decades to even begin to rebuild. The night never announces itself as dangerous. It doesn't dim the lights or quiet the music in warning. It carries on exactly as it always has, wrapping everything in a sense of routine so complete that even the smallest deviations go unnoticed. That's what makes the moment of rupture so difficult to see, not just in real time, but even after, when people go back and search for it. For Sarah Spires, the night of January 26, 1996, unfolded with the same loose rhythm as countless others in Claremont. The air was warm, carrying the kind of late summer softness that makes time feel slower, less urgent. The streets were alive, but not chaotic. There was movement, conversation, music bleeding out from open doors, but nothing that suggested instability. Nothing that hinted at what would come. She moved through that space as part of it, not separate from it. She wasn't standing out, wasn't drawing attention. Just another young woman among many, navigating the end of a night that had stretched into early morning. At some point, a decision was made, the kind of small, practical decision that happens without much thought. It was time to go home. The phone call came from a public booth, one of those fixed points in a city that people rely on without really noticing. She dialed, waited, spoke. There was an agreement. Someone would come. She would wait. And so she did. There is something deeply ordinary about waiting. It doesn't feel like a moment of risk. It feels temporary, contained. You stand under the nearest light, maybe shift your weight from one foot to the other, watch the occasional car pass, listen to the distant hum of conversation. It's a pause, nothing more. But pauses create openings. What happened next exists in a space without witnesses. No one steps forward later with a clear account. No one describes a struggle or a raised voice. There is no sequence of events that can be laid out with confidence. Only the result. At some point between that call and the arrival of the car that was meant to take her home, something interrupted the ordinary flow of the night. It didn't leave visible damage behind. It didn't break the surface in a way that drew immediate attention. It was precise, controlled, and fast enough to go unnoticed in a place that was not empty, not isolated, not obviously unsafe. If there was a conversation, it was brief. If there was hesitation, it didn't escalate into something others could see. If there was force, it was contained within a narrow window of time and space. And then she was gone. Not gradually. Not in a way that could be tracked step by step. Just a clean absence where a person had been moments before. When the car arrived and she wasn't there, the night didn't react. The music didn't stop. The people nearby didn't turn and look. Life continued, indifferent to the fact that something irreversible had just occurred. It's only in hindsight that the scene becomes charged with meaning. The light above the phone booth feels harsher. The empty space where she stood feels heavier. Every passing car becomes a potential clue, every shadow a possible hiding place. But at the time, it was just another stretch of street, just another late hour, just another moment that slipped by without anyone marking it as significant. Months later, on June 9th, the pattern began to take shape, though no one could yet see its full outline. Jane Rimmer moved through the same area, under different conditions but within the same broader environment. The season had shifted. The warmth of summer had given way to cooler air, a subtle change that affected how people dressed, how long they lingered outside, how quickly they moved between places. But the structure of the night remained familiar. She had been out, part of the same nightlife that defined Claremont after dark. There were witnesses this time, fragments of her evening captured in memory. She was seen leaving a venue. Seen walking. Seen existing within the shared awareness of others. Those sightings create a sense of continuity, but they also highlight the moment when that continuity breaks. There is a last confirmed point, a place where she was undeniably present. After that, everything becomes uncertain. The timeline stretches thin, filled with possibilities but no certainties. Somewhere along that stretch, she encountered the person who would end her life. Again, there is no clear record of how that encounter began. It could have been casual, almost invisible to anyone watching. A car pulling up. A brief exchange. A decision that seemed harmless in the moment. Or it could have been something more forceful, something that unfolded just out of sight, shielded by darkness or distance, or the simple fact that people weren't expecting to witness anything unusual. What matters is not the exact sequence, but the outcome. She left the visible world of Claremont and was taken somewhere else. That transition, from a public, social environment to a private, controlled one, is where the crime truly takes shape. It's where intention becomes action, where the person responsible moves from opportunity to execution. And unlike Sarah's case, this one does not end in disappearance alone. Time passes. Searches begin. Questions multiply. And then, nearly 2 months later, the search yields something that changes everything. Her body is found, not in the place she was last seen, but far from it, in a location that suggests planning, movement, and a level of control that cannot be dismissed as impulsive. The discovery reframes the entire sequence. It forces investigators to reconsider not just what happened, but how it happened. The distance between Claremont and the recovery site becomes a critical detail, one that speaks to the offender's ability to operate beyond a single environment. It also introduces a new, more disturbing dimension to the case. Because now there is evidence of what comes after the initial encounter. And it is enough to confirm that this is not an isolated incident waiting for explanation. It is something more structured. More deliberate. By the time March 15, 1997 arrives, the city is no longer entirely unaware. There is unease now, a subtle tension that lingers beneath the surface of normal life. People still go out. They still gather in the same places. But there is an added layer of caution, an awareness that wasn't there before. And still, it isn't enough. Kira Glennon enters that same space, carrying with her the confidence of routine, the expectation that the night will end the way it always has. She moves through the evening without incident. Conversations, drinks, the gradual winding down of activity as the hours pass. At some point, she leaves the central cluster of venues, stepping into the quieter edges of the night where fewer people remain, where the energy has shifted from lively to subdued. This is where the pattern tightens. Another woman alone. Another moment of transition between public and private space. Another opportunity. What happens next follows the same invisible trajectory. An encounter that does not register as alarming to those nearby. A shift that occurs just beyond the reach of attention. A disappearance that leaves no immediate trace. But by now, the absence carries more weight. When she does not return, when contact cannot be established, the possibility that once felt distant now sits at the forefront of every thought. And when her body is found, the pattern becomes undeniable in a way that cannot be ignored or explained away. 3 events. 3 women. Each one taken from the same general area, under similar conditions, within a span of just over a year. The incidents are no longer isolated points. They are connected by method, by timing, by a consistency that suggests not randomness, but repetition. And repetition implies intent. It implies someone who has done this before. Someone who has refined their approach. Someone who understands the environment well enough to navigate it without drawing attention. In each case, the critical moment, the moment where everything changes, remains hidden. It exists in that narrow gap between what is seen and what is not, between presence and absence. That gap is where the offender operates. It's where control is established, where the victim is separated from the safety of the public space and drawn into something far more dangerous. And it's precisely because that moment is so difficult to observe that the crimes are able to occur at all. Because nothing about the environment, on the surface, appears to invite it. The streets are lit. The venues are populated. The routines are familiar. But familiarity can be deceptive. It can create a sense of predictability that makes people lower their guard, that makes them trust the structure of their surroundings without questioning what might exist just beyond it. The person responsible understood that. Understood how to move within that structure without disrupting it. Understood how to identify the exact moment when someone becomes vulnerable, not because they are careless, but because they are simply living their life in a way that feels normal. And once that moment is identified, everything else follows with a precision that leaves very little behind. No witnesses who can say for certain what they saw. No clear sequence of events that can be reconstructed without gaps. Just 3 lives intersecting with the same unseen force, each one taken in a way that feels both sudden and eerily controlled. The horror of it doesn't come from chaos. It comes from how seamlessly it fits into the ordinary. How easily it hides within it. How, even as it unfolds, the world around it continues without interruption. Because that is what allows it to happen more than once. And that is what makes it so difficult to stop. The first thing investigators learn to trust is what the scene refuses to give them. Not what's visible, not what can be photographed or bagged and labeled, but the absence of disruption where there should be some. The quiet that lingers too neatly. The way a place looks untouched when something has clearly gone wrong. In the early hours following the disappearance of Sarah Spires, the street in Claremont looked exactly as it had the night before, and the nights before that. The pavement held no sign of struggle. The public phone stood upright, unchanged, its receiver hanging where she had left it or placed back carefully, depending on which small detail one chose to believe. There were no broken objects, no scattered belongings, nothing that suggested urgency or force. Police arriving at the scene had to work with something far more difficult than chaos. They had to work with stillness. They mapped the area anyway, measuring distances that seemed insignificant at first. The stretch from the phone booth to the curb. The angle of the nearest streetlight. The position of nearby businesses and their closing times. They spoke to anyone who might have been there, reconstructing the night through fragments of memory that were already beginning to blur. Witnesses offered pieces, but never a full picture. Someone remembered seeing a girl at the phone. Someone else recalled a car slowing down nearby, though they couldn't describe it clearly. Another thought they heard a voice, but couldn't be sure if it was connected to anything unusual. Each statement added something, but also introduced uncertainty. Because none of them confirmed what mattered most. No one saw her leave. No one saw her taken. Investigators began to consider what kind of encounter could occur in that space without drawing attention. The lighting was not dim enough to conceal obvious violence, yet it was not bright enough to eliminate shadows entirely. There were gaps, small pockets of reduced visibility where someone could stand without being clearly observed. And then there was timing. The early morning hours create a specific kind of environment. Fewer people, but not none. Enough movement to create distraction, but not enough to ensure constant awareness. It is a balance that can be exploited by someone who understands it. The absence of physical evidence suggested control. Either the encounter was brief and contained, or it was structured in a way that minimized resistance. There were no drag marks, no signs of a prolonged struggle. Whatever happened, it happened quickly. Without a body, the scene remained incomplete. There was no secondary location to examine, no physical confirmation of what had taken place beyond the moment of disappearance. Everything hinged on that single point in time, that narrow window where she had been visible and then wasn't. And that made the investigation feel like reaching into empty space. When Jane Rimmer disappeared months later, the approach shifted slightly, informed by what had already been experienced but not yet understood. This time, there was an expectation, not fully formed, not officially acknowledged, but present, that the event might follow a similar pattern. The area where she was last seen became the focus. Investigators retraced her steps, identified the last confirmed sightings, and built a timeline that narrowed the window of uncertainty as much as possible. Again, the environment offered little resistance to the narrative of normalcy. The streets had not changed. The same venues operated under the same conditions. The same patterns of movement existed, people arriving, leaving, gathering, dispersing. And within that pattern, Jane's presence faded. But unlike before, the story did not end at the point of disappearance. When her body was discovered nearly 2 months later, the investigation expanded outward, shifting from a single location to a connected sequence of events. The recovery site was different in every way from Claremont. Quieter. More isolated. A place where the absence of witnesses was not surprising, but expected. The condition of the scene told its own story, one that did not rely on speculation. There were physical indicators now, evidence that could be examined, tested, compared. The terrain, the positioning, the surrounding environment all contributed to an understanding of what had happened after she was taken. Investigators moved carefully, aware that every detail mattered. The ground was examined for impressions, for disturbances that might indicate movement. Vegetation was noted, not just for its condition but for what it might have concealed or revealed at the time. The placement of the body was documented with precision, not as an abstract detail, but as a reflection of intent. Forensic teams began the meticulous process of collecting samples. Fibers, trace materials, anything that could establish a connection between victim and offender. At this stage, even the smallest fragment held potential significance. The presence of a body changed the nature of the investigation, but it also introduced new challenges. Evidence degrades over time. Exposure to the element alters what can be recovered. The delay between the crime and the discovery created gaps that could not be fully closed. Still, it was more than they had before. And it confirmed something critical. This was not a disappearance that ended in uncertainty. It was a crime that extended beyond the initial encounter. By the time Kira Glennon vanished, investigators were no longer starting from a position of ambiguity. There was a framework now, a developing understanding that linked these events together even before all the evidence had been fully analyzed. The location where she was last seen was treated with heightened urgency. Officers moved quickly to secure the area, to identify witnesses, to preserve anything that might otherwise be lost. But again, the immediate scene resisted them. No obvious signs of struggle. No clear indication of how the encounter had unfolded. The pattern held. Which meant the answers lay elsewhere. When her body was found, the connection between the cases tightened further. The recovery site, like Jane's, was removed from the social environment of Claremont. It suggested the same kind of movement, the same ability to transport a victim from a populated area to a more controlled setting. The forensic examination followed the same careful process, but with an added layer of comparison. Evidence from this scene was not just analyzed in isolation, but against what had already been collected from the previous case. Patterns began to emerge, not just in the circumstances of the disappearances, but in the physical details left behind. Trace evidence became central. Fibers that did not belong to the environment. Materials that could not be explained by chance contact. These were the threads that investigators began to follow, even when they led into uncertain territory. DNA, still evolving as a tool at the time, offered potential but not immediate resolution. Samples were collected, stored, and tested within the limits of the technology available. Results could indicate connections, but not always identities. The evidence pointed toward a single offender, but it did not yet reveal who that offender was. Back in Claremont, the original scene of Sarah's disappearance took on new significance. What had once seemed like an isolated event now appeared to be the starting point of a sequence. Investigators revisited it with fresh perspective, looking for details that might have been overlooked, re-examining witness statements in light of what had since been learned. But the fundamental challenge remained. There was no physical link tying that location directly to the others. No body. No definitive evidence of what had occurred beyond the moment of absence. It became a void within the investigation, a space that resisted closure, that refused to align neatly with the emerging pattern. And yet, it could not be separated from it. The three cases formed a structure that was both clear and incomplete. Each one contributed to the overall picture, but none of them provided the full image on their own. Investigators were left working between these fragments, connecting what they could, acknowledging what they could not. They built timelines that overlapped, maps that highlighted common areas, profiles that attempted to define the person responsible based on behavior rather than identity. The scenes themselves, both the places of disappearance and the sites of recovery, became anchors in that process. They were the fixed points in a case defined by movement, by transitions from visibility to invisibility. And in each of those points, the same unsettling truth emerged. The offender understood space. Understood how to operate within it without leaving obvious traces. Understood how to move between environments in a way that minimized risk and maximized control. The evidence did not shout. It did not present itself clearly or completely. It existed in fragments. In fibers that did not belong. In timelines that aligned too closely to be coincidence. In the repetition of a method that, while never fully visible, could be felt in the gaps it left behind. For investigators, that meant working in a constant state of partial understanding. Knowing enough to see the shape of the problem, but not enough to solve it. And for the families, it meant something even harder. Knowing that the places where their loved ones had last been seen, and the places where some of them had been found, held answers that could not yet be fully accessed. That somewhere within those quiet streets and isolated landscapes, the truth existed. But remained just out of reach. The investigation did not collapse all at once. It stretched, thinned, and then spread outward in directions that felt promising at first, only to fade into silence. Each new lead carried a brief surge of momentum, a sense that something had finally shifted into focus. And then, just as quickly, that focus blurred again, leaving behind nothing but paperwork and the quiet frustration of unanswered questions. In the months following the disappearance of Sarah Spires, detectives worked with what little they had, building hypotheses out of fragments. Without a body, without physical evidence that could anchor the case, they were forced to rely heavily on patterns of behavior and probability. Who had been in the area that night? Who had access to a vehicle? Who had a history that suggested escalation? Names began to surface. Some came from tips, others from routine checks, others still from the instinctive pull investigators feel toward individuals who don't quite fit. Men who had been seen loitering. Men who had prior records involving violence or sexual offenses. Men who, on paper, existed just outside the boundaries of normal. Each one was examined. Backgrounds pulled apart. Alibis tested. Movements traced through receipts, phone records, witness accounts. Some cooperated easily, answering questions with practiced calm. Others bristled, defensive or evasive, their discomfort raising suspicion even when it could be explained. But suspicion is not evidence. Time passed, and with it came the second case. When Jane Rimmer was found, the investigation shifted from possibility to urgency. Now there was confirmation of a violent crime, and with it, a clearer mandate to identify the person responsible before it happened again. Task forces expanded. Resources increased. The scale of the investigation grew to match the severity of the situation. Officers worked longer hours, moving between interview rooms and evidence labs, their focus narrowing around a single objective. Find him. The list of suspects widened even as individual leads collapsed. Some men seemed plausible at first glance, their proximity to the area or their past behavior aligning with the emerging profile. One had been known to frequent the same nightlife spots, often alone, watching rather than participating. Another had a record that included offenses against women, his name already familiar within certain investigative circles. Each time, the process followed the same arc: interest, scrutiny, elimination. Alibis held up under pressure. DNA did not match. Timelines failed to align. What initially appeared suspicious dissolved under closer examination, leaving investigators to start again from a slightly different angle. And then there were the false leads, the ones that carried just enough weight to demand attention, but ultimately led nowhere. Anonymous tips from the public, some detailed, others vague. Reports of strange behavior that, in isolation, meant little but in context seemed worth exploring. One tip described a man offering rides to women late at night, his demeanor friendly but insistent. Another spoke of a vehicle seen circling the same block repeatedly, its driver never exiting, never engaging, just watching. These details fed into the growing sense that the offender was not acting randomly, but deliberately, selecting moments and targets with care. Yet none of it was enough. By the time Kira Glennon disappeared, the investigation had already accumulated layers of complexity. Multiple cases, overlapping evidence, a suspect pool that had grown both broader and more difficult to navigate. The addition of a third victim did not simplify the work. It intensified it. Now the pressure was undeniable. Public fear had reached a point where it could no longer be managed quietly. Media coverage expanded, bringing with it scrutiny, speculation, and a constant demand for updates that investigators could not yet provide. Every development, no matter how small, was examined and interpreted, sometimes accurately, often not. Within the investigative teams, the atmosphere shifted. Fatigue began to settle in, not just physical but cognitive. The repetition of dead ends, the constant revisiting of the same questions without new answers, created a sense of stagnation that was difficult to break. Still, they continued. Profiles were developed, refined, and adjusted as new information emerged. The offender was likely familiar with the area. Likely comfortable operating at night. Likely able to present himself in a way that did not immediately alarm his victims. There was an assumption of mobility, of access to a vehicle, of a level of control that suggested prior experience or at least a capacity for planning. But profiles describe tendencies, not identities. And tendencies do not lead to arrests on their own. The forensic evidence, particularly DNA, held promise but also limitation. Samples had been collected, analyzed, and compared, but without a match in existing databases, they remained anonymous markers of presence rather than proof of identity. Investigators knew the offender had left something behind. They just didn't know whose it was. This created a strange dynamic within the investigation. They were chasing someone who, in a very real sense, had already been at the scene, had already intersected with the evidence they possessed. He was not hypothetical. He was not abstract. He was real. But he remained unseen. Over time, the investigation began to branch into less direct avenues. Geographic profiling, attempting to map the likely home or base of the offender based on the locations of the crimes. Behavioral analysis, looking for patterns in the timing and selection of victims. Cross-referencing with other cases, both local and interstate, to identify potential links that might expand the scope. Each approach offered insight, but not resolution. There were moments when a particular suspect seemed to align with multiple aspects of the case. A man whose work schedule placed him near Claremont during the relevant hours. Another whose vehicle type matched vague witness descriptions. Another still whose past behavior suggested escalation toward more serious offenses. Each time, the investigation tightened around them, evidence gathered, interviews conducted, surveillance sometimes initiated. And each time, something failed to connect. An alibi confirmed by independent witnesses. A DNA sample that excluded them. A timeline that, upon closer examination, placed them elsewhere at the critical moment. The pattern repeated so often that it began to feel almost mechanical. Identify. Investigate. Eliminate. The cycle itself became part of the problem. Because with each elimination, the remaining pool of possibilities did not necessarily become clearer. Instead, it became more uncertain. The offender was not where they expected him to be. Not among the obvious candidates, not within the profiles that seemed most convincing. Which raised a more unsettling possibility. What if he was someone who did not stand out at all? Someone whose background did not immediately trigger suspicion. Someone who blended into the environment so completely that he passed through these filters without resistance. This idea shifted the investigation in subtle ways. It forced detectives to reconsider assumptions, to look beyond the familiar categories of suspect and consider a broader range of possibilities. But broadening the scope also increased the difficulty. Because now, almost anyone could fit. As the years passed, the case began to take on a different character. It moved from active urgency to a kind of suspended state. Not closed, not abandoned, but no longer producing the steady stream of leads that had once driven it forward. Files grew thicker. Evidence was stored, catalogued, preserved for a future that investigators hoped would bring new tools, new methods, new ways of seeing what had previously been invisible. For the families, this transition was particularly difficult. The early phase of an investigation carries with it a sense of movement, of progress, even if that progress is uncertain. There are updates, developments, moments where it feels like the truth might be close. But as time stretches on, that movement slows. Updates become less frequent. Developments more sporadic. The case remains open, but it no longer feels active in the same way. And yet, it never truly stops. Because somewhere within all those interviews, all those pieces of evidence, all those dismissed suspects and abandoned leads, the answer still exists. It hasn't changed. It hasn't disappeared. It is simply waiting for the moment when everything aligns in a way that reveals it. Until then, the investigation remains caught between what is known and what cannot yet be proven. A space defined not by lack of effort, but by the limits of what can be seen. And within that space, the most dangerous element is not the absence of suspects. It is the presence of one who has not yet been recognized. Time does something strange to investigations like this. It doesn't erase them, not really. Instead, it presses them flat, like pages in a book that no one has opened in years, waiting for a reason to be read again. The names remain. The evidence remains. But the urgency, the sharp, immediate need to act, softens into something quieter, more patient. For years, the cases of Sarah Spires, Jane Rimmer, and Kira Glennon existed in that state. They were never forgotten. But they were unresolved. Boxes of evidence sat in controlled environments, each item catalogued, preserved, waiting for a future that might be able to do more with it than the past could. Interview transcripts gathered dust, their pages filled with voices that had once felt close to the truth but never quite reached it. Investigators came and went, some retiring, others moving on, each carrying with them a piece of the case that had never fully let go. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. It didn't start with a confession. It didn't begin with a witness stepping forward after years of silence. It started in a place far removed from the streets of Claremont, in environments defined not by memory or instinct, but by precision. Laboratories. By the early 2000s and into the following decade, forensic science had changed in ways that those early investigators could not have fully anticipated. Techniques that once produced partial or inconclusive results had become more refined, more sensitive. DNA, once a promising but limited tool, had evolved into something far more powerful. Samples that had been collected years earlier, carefully stored, preserved despite their age, were brought back into the light. Tested again. Re-examined under methods that could extract more information than before. What had once been a faint signal began to sharpen. Profiles that had been incomplete became clearer. Fragments aligned in ways they hadn't before. And within that clarity, something emerged that had always been there but never fully seen. A genetic signature. Not a name yet. Not a face. But something distinct enough to narrow the field in a way that had not been possible before. Investigators began to cross-reference this profile against databases that had grown significantly over the years. Thousands of individuals, their genetic information stored for comparison in cases just like this. Each match attempt carried a quiet tension, a question that had been asked countless times before but now felt different. Could this be it? Most of the time, the answer was no. The profile did not match those already known to the system. Which meant something both frustrating and revealing. The person responsible had not been caught for other crimes that resulted in DNA being logged. Or if he had, his profile had not yet been entered. This realization shifted the investigation again. Because it suggested that the offender might not fit the expected pattern of a known repeat offender, at least not in a way that had been officially recorded. Attention turned toward broader comparisons. Individuals who had come into contact with law enforcement in other contexts. Those whose DNA might have been collected for reasons unrelated to these cases. Men who had existed on the edges of the investigation before, considered but not fully examined. And among those names, one began to surface with increasing weight. Bradley Robert Edwards. At first, there was nothing overtly dramatic about his inclusion. He was not a public figure. Not someone whose name immediately triggered recognition or fear. He had lived a life that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. Employment, routine, a presence that did not stand out in obvious ways. But beneath that surface, there were details. Past offenses that had not, at the time, been linked to the Claremont cases in any definitive way. Incidents that suggested a pattern of behavior, a trajectory that, when viewed in isolation, might not have seemed connected, but when placed alongside the emerging DNA evidence, began to form a more coherent picture. Investigators revisited his history with renewed focus. Timelines were reconstructed, placing him in relation to the events of 1996 and 1997. His movements, his access, his proximity to the areas in question, all of it examined not as isolated data points, but as parts of a larger pattern. And then came the comparison. The DNA profile extracted from the evidence was tested against his. This was the moment the entire investigation had been moving toward, even if it hadn't known it at the time. Years of work. Thousands of hours. Countless leads that had led nowhere. All narrowing down to a single question. Does it match? When the answer came, it did not arrive with spectacle. There was no immediate public announcement, no dramatic confrontation. Just a confirmation, quiet but absolute. Yes. The profile matched. The genetic signature that had been present at the scenes, preserved through years of uncertainty, now had a name attached to it. And with that, everything changed. The man who had existed as an unseen presence within the investigation, an unknown figure defined only by patterns and fragments, was suddenly real in a way that could not be dismissed. He had a face. A history. A life that had unfolded alongside the very investigation that had been trying to find him. For investigators, this was both a breakthrough and a reckoning. The realization that the person they had been searching for had not been hiding in some distant, unreachable place, but had been living within the same broader community, moving through the same spaces, existing in parallel with the search itself. Surveillance began. Careful, deliberate, designed to confirm what the DNA had already suggested. Movements were tracked. Habits observed. Interactions noted. Not because they needed to prove his presence in the past, that had already been established, but because they needed to build a case that could stand in court. The weight of years pressed heavily on this phase. Evidence had to be re-examined, contextualized within this new understanding. Every piece had to align, not just scientifically, but narratively, forming a sequence that could be presented clearly and convincingly. In December 2016, the investigation reached a point where waiting was no longer necessary. He was arrested. The moment itself was controlled, procedural, far removed from the chaos one might expect given the magnitude of the case. But beneath that control was something far more significant. An ending to uncertainty. Not to the story itself, but to the question of who. For the families, the news arrived with a complexity that is difficult to fully articulate. Relief, certainly. The knowledge that the person responsible had been identified, that he could no longer exist as an unknown threat. But also something else. The weight of finally attaching a face to the loss. The understanding that the abstract figure who had taken so much was, in fact, a person who had lived, worked, and moved through the world like anyone else. No longer a shadow. No longer a question. But a man who would now have to answer for what he had done. And yet, even in that moment of breakthrough, there remained one unresolved thread. Because while the evidence connected him definitively to some of the crimes, not every question had been answered. Not every detail had been recovered. Not every absence had been filled. The case had moved from mystery to identification. But the full story, the complete understanding of how and why, was still unfolding. And that would come next. The courtroom does not feel like the streets where it began. There are no neon lights bleeding into the pavement, no laughter dissolving into the night air, no quiet gaps between footsteps where something unseen can take hold. Everything here is contained. Defined. Measured in procedure and language that leaves little room for ambiguity. And yet, as the trial begins, the weight of everything that happened in those unguarded moments years ago is carried into this space, piece by piece, until it fills the room in a way no one can ignore. At the center of it sits Bradley Robert Edwards. He does not look like the version of him that existed in speculation for over 2 decades. There is no shadow obscuring his face, no distortion that marks him as something separate from the ordinary. He sits still, contained within the boundaries of the courtroom, dressed in a way that blends into the environment rather than disrupts it. That, more than anything, is what unsettles people. Because for years, the person responsible for the deaths of Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon, and the disappearance of Sarah Spires, existed as an idea shaped by fear and uncertainty. Something abstract, almost larger than life in its ability to evade detection. Now he is simply a man sitting in a chair, listening. The trial unfolds slowly, deliberately. There is no rush. Every detail must be presented, every connection explained, every piece of evidence placed within a structure that allows it to be understood not just as isolated information, but as part of a coherent whole. The prosecution begins to reconstruct the past, not through dramatic retelling, but through accumulation. They start with the evidence. DNA becomes the backbone of the case, the thread that runs through everything else. Experts take the stand, explaining processes that once felt experimental but are now established, precise. They speak of samples collected decades earlier, preserved with care, re-examined as technology advanced. They describe how those samples produced a profile, how that profile remained consistent across different pieces of evidence, and how, when compared to Edwards, it matched. The language is technical, but the implication is simple. He was there. Not in a theoretical sense. Not as a possibility. But physically present, in direct contact with the victims in ways that cannot be explained by coincidence. The courtroom absorbs this information in silence. There is no visible reaction from Edwards, no outward shift that signals how the words are landing. He remains composed, his expression controlled, as if the details being described belong to someone else. But the evidence does not stand alone. It is supported by fibers, small, almost invisible fragments that carry their own significance. Specialists explain how these fibers were recovered, how they were analyzed, how they link back to materials associated with Edwards' vehicle. The connection is not broad or speculative. It is specific, grounded in physical comparison. Again, the implication is clear. The victims had been in contact with something that belonged to him. From there, the prosecution expands outward, building context. They introduce his past, not as a series of unrelated incidents, but as a pattern of behavior that aligns with what has been established. Prior offenses involving women, moments where control and proximity played a role, where boundaries were crossed in ways that suggested escalation rather than isolation. Each piece adds weight. Not enough on its own to define him entirely, but together forming a picture that becomes increasingly difficult to separate from the crimes in question. the defense responds with a different approach. They do not deny the presence of DNA outright. Instead, they challenge its interpretation. They question how it might have been transferred, whether secondary contact could account for its presence, whether the passage of time has introduced uncertainty into the analysis. They focus on gaps. The absence of direct witnesses. The lack of a complete narrative that traces every moment from disappearance to discovery. The fact that, in the case of Sarah Spires, there is no body, no definitive evidence that establishes how or where her life ended. These are not insignificant points. They are the spaces within the case where certainty is less absolute, where the story relies on inference rather than direct observation. The courtroom becomes a place of tension between these two perspectives. On one side, a structure built from science, pattern, and accumulation. On the other, an emphasis on doubt, on the limits of what can be proven beyond all reasonable question. As the trial continues, witnesses take the stand. Some are experts, their testimony precise, focused on data and analysis. Others are more personal, connected to the victims, bringing with them a different kind of weight. Family members speak. Not in dramatic declarations, but in quiet, controlled voices that carry the impact of years. They describe who these women were, not as victims, but as people. The routines they followed. The relationships they built. The absence that followed their disappearance, and how it reshaped everything that came after. When they speak, the courtroom shifts. The case is no longer just about evidence. It is about loss. About time that did not heal in the way it was supposed to. About questions that lingered for decades without answers. Edwards listens to all of this. He does not interrupt. He does not react visibly. But his presence in the room changes the dynamic in ways that are impossible to ignore. Because for the first time, the people who suffered the consequences of his actions are in the same space as the person identified as responsible. The distance that once existed, geographical, temporal, psychological, is gone. What remains is confrontation. Not the kind that involves raised voices or dramatic exchanges, but something quieter and more enduring. The simple fact of being seen. As the trial approaches its conclusion, the judge begins to bring everything together. The evidence is reviewed, not in isolation, but as a complete structure. Each element is considered in relation to the others, forming a chain that either holds or breaks under scrutiny. In this case, it holds. The DNA evidence is accepted as reliable, its presence at critical points in the case established beyond reasonable doubt. The fiber evidence supports the connection, reinforcing the likelihood of contact between Edwards and the victims. The patterns of behavior, the timelines, the absence of alternative explanations, all of it aligns. When the verdict is delivered, it is measured, precise. Guilty. For the murders of Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon. Not guilty for the murder of Sarah Spires, not because the court finds him innocent in a broader sense, but because the evidence does not meet the threshold required for conviction in that specific charge. It is a distinction that matters legally, even if it does little to ease the weight of her absence. The sentencing follows. Life imprisonment. No possibility of parole. A statement, not just about punishment, but about permanence. He will not return to the world outside this room. For the families, the moment is not one of celebration. There is no sense of victory in the traditional sense. What has been lost cannot be restored, no matter the outcome. But there is something else. An end to the question of who. A shift from uncertainty to acknowledgement. The person responsible has been identified, judged, and removed from the possibility of causing further harm. It does not close every wound. It does not answer every question. But it changes the shape of the story. From one defined by absence and speculation, to one anchored, finally, in truth. There is a strange quiet that comes after a case like this ends. Not the kind of quiet that settles over a city at night, soft and temporary, but something deeper. A silence that carries weight. A silence that feels earned, but not entirely welcome. Because when the trial is over, when the verdict has been delivered, when Bradley Robert Edwards is no longer a question but a confirmed answer, the world does not simply return to what it was before. It cannot. Too much has been seen. Too much has been learned about the fragile line between safety and danger, between ordinary life and something that can rupture it without warning. In Perth, the streets of Claremont still glow at night. The bars still fill with people. Music still spills out into the air, and laughter still carries across the pavement. But something fundamental has shifted. Not visibly, not in a way you can point to and say this is where everything changed. But in the way people move. The way they think. The way they measure risk in moments that once felt effortless. There are small habits now. Checking over a shoulder. Waiting for a friend before leaving. Choosing a well-lit path over a shorter one. None of these actions feel dramatic. They don't interrupt life in any obvious way. But they exist because of what happened, because of what was learned, because of the understanding that safety is not a fixed state, but something that can be lost. For the families of Sarah Spires, Jane Rimmer, and Kira Glennon, the aftermath is not defined by the trial alone. The verdict did not begin their grief, and it does not end it. It simply changes its shape. For Jane and Kira's families, there is at least a form of closure that comes with certainty. The knowledge of what happened, the identification of who was responsible, the confirmation that their daughters did not simply vanish into an unsolvable mystery. There is a place to direct their thoughts, their anger, their questions. A person. A name. A reality that, while painful, is defined. But even within that, there is no sense of resolution in the emotional sense. Grief does not conclude because a case does. It continues, quieter perhaps, less consumed by uncertainty, but no less present. Birthdays still arrive. Anniversaries still pass. Moments still occur where absence is felt sharply, unexpectedly, in the middle of something ordinary. A chair at a table. A voice missing from a conversation. A future that was once imagined but never realized. For Sarah's family, the aftermath carries an additional layer. Because while the court delivered answers in part, it did not answer everything. Her body has never been found. There is no final place to visit. No physical marker that allows grief to anchor itself in something tangible. Only the knowledge that she was taken. And the unanswered question of where she is. That kind of absence does not settle easily. It lingers in a different way, creating a space where hope and acceptance exist side by side, never fully resolving into one or the other. The case may be legally concluded. But for them, it is not complete. Beyond the families, the investigation itself leaves a legacy that extends far beyond the individuals involved. The Claremont case became a turning point in how law enforcement approaches complex, long-term investigations. It highlighted the importance of preserving evidence, even when immediate answers are not available. It demonstrated the value of patience, of allowing time and technology to catch up with what once seemed unsolvable. DNA, which once existed as a developing tool, became central not just to this case, but to countless others that followed. The idea that evidence collected today might only reveal its full meaning years later is now embedded in investigative practice. There is a recognition that cases do not expire. They wait. And sometimes, waiting is not failure, but part of the process. But alongside these advancements, there is also a more difficult reflection. Because the case raises questions that do not have easy answers. How does someone like Edwards exist within a community without drawing attention for so long? How does he move through ordinary life, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, while carrying out acts that exist in complete contradiction to it? There is no single explanation. No clear dividing line that separates people like him from everyone else. And that is what unsettles people the most. Because it challenges the instinct to believe that danger is always visible, always identifiable if you look closely enough. In reality, it often is not. It hides in plain sight. It adapts. It learns. And sometimes, it goes unnoticed until it is too late. That realization does not mean people should live in constant fear. But it does change the way they understand the world around them. It introduces a layer of awareness that was not there before, a quiet acknowledgement that safety is not guaranteed. At the same time, the case also reveals something else. Persistence. The fact that, despite years of dead ends, despite the weight of uncertainty, the investigation did not stop. It continued, carried forward by individuals who refused to let the case fade into obscurity. That persistence matters. Because without it, the outcome would have been different. Without it, the evidence would have remained just fragments, the names just unresolved stories, the truth just out of reach. Instead, there is an answer. Incomplete in some ways, but real. And in that reality, there is a form of accountability that would not have existed otherwise. In the years since the trial, the story of Claremont has been told and retold. Not as a simple narrative, but as something layered, complex, resistant to being reduced to a single meaning. For some, it is a story about crime and punishment. For others, it is about loss and memory. For investigators, it is a case study in persistence and the evolution of forensic science. But at its core, it remains something more human. A story about 3 women whose lives were interrupted in ways that cannot be undone. A story about families who endured years of uncertainty before reaching a form of truth. A story about a community that was forced to confront the idea that danger can exist within the familiar. And perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder that behind every case, every investigation, every headline, there are people who existed long before the moment that defined them in public memory. Sarah Spiers was not just a name in a file. She was a young woman at the beginning of her life, standing under a streetlight, expecting to go home. Jane Rimmer was not just evidence in a courtroom. She was someone building a future, moving through her world with purpose and connection. Kira Glennon was not just part of a pattern. She was a person who had already created a life, who had people waiting for her, who should have had more time. That is what remains, even after everything else has been processed and understood. Not the fear. Not the investigation. Not even the trial. But the recognition of what was lost. And the understanding that remembering them, not just how their lives ended, but how they lived, is the only way to ensure that their stories are not reduced to the moment they were taken. Because in the end, justice can name the person responsible. It can assign consequences. It can close a case. But it cannot restore what was taken. It can only stand as a line drawn after the fact, marking the point where the search for answers finally reached something solid. Everything beyond that line, the grief, the memory, the quiet changes in how people see the world, that continues. Unresolved in its own way. But no longer invisible. There is always a final layer to stories like this, one that does not belong to the investigation, the trial, or even the public record. It exists in the quieter spaces, where time has already done its work, where the urgency of finding answers has faded and been replaced by something more reflective, more permanent. In the years after the conviction of Bradley Robert Edwards, the world around Claremont continued to move forward in ways that were both ordinary and changed. New people arrived, new businesses opened, new nights unfolded under the same streetlights that once marked the beginning of something unthinkable. On the surface, everything resembled normal life again. But beneath that surface, there was a memory embedded into the place itself, something that could not be removed or rewritten. For many who lived through those years, the case became a reference point in how they understood safety. Not in an abstract sense, but in daily decisions that rarely felt connected to the past, even though they were shaped by it. Parents became more cautious about late nights. Friends waited for each other before leaving crowded venues. Strangers were observed with a little more attention than before, not out of paranoia, but out of awareness that the world had once proven itself more unpredictable than it appeared. This shift was subtle, but lasting. And yet, life did not stop. It rarely does in the aftermath of tragedy. Instead, it adapts. It absorbs what has happened and continues, carrying forward both the memory and the movement of everyday existence. For the families of Jane Rimmer and Kira Glennon, there is a form of resolution that comes with knowing. Knowing who was responsible, knowing how the case unfolded, knowing that the person who took their loved ones has been held accountable within the limits of the law. That knowledge does not erase grief, but it gives it structure. It allows memory to exist alongside understanding, rather than alongside uncertainty. They can speak their names now without the shadow of unanswered questions attached to every sentence. They can remember them as daughters, sisters, friends, not only as victims of a case that once seemed endless. But even in that clarity, there is no simplicity. Because time does not return what it takes. It only changes the way absence is carried. For the family of Sarah Spires, the absence remains different. Her story is still marked by what has not been recovered, by the lack of a final resting place, by the unanswered question that continues to exist alongside the confirmed facts of the investigation. There is a unique kind of weight in not having closure in a physical sense, in not being able to point to a place and say this is where she is. Instead, there is only memory, preserved through people rather than location, through recollection rather than certainty. And yet, even within that unresolved space, her presence remains intact in the lives of those who knew her. Not defined by disappearance, but by everything that came before it. That distinction matters more than it may appear. Because over time, cases like this risk collapsing into a single narrative focused only on how lives ended. But what resists that collapse are the details that refuse to fade. The personality of each woman. The small, unrecorded moments that were never part of any investigation but remain central to those who remember them. A laugh that someone still hears clearly years later. A habit that remains vivid in memory. A conversation that, at the time, felt ordinary but now carries unintended weight. These are the things that persist beyond documentation. The investigation itself has also left a lasting imprint, not just on those directly involved, but on how similar cases are approached in the present. The importance of preserving evidence over long periods of time, the value of re-examining cold cases as technology evolves, the understanding that time does not diminish the potential for resolution, all of these lessons have become embedded in modern investigative practice. What once seemed like a closed chapter after years of uncertainty became, instead, an example of how persistence can eventually intersect with progress. DNA evidence, once limited in its application, became a defining factor in establishing accountability. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually with enough clarity to transform suspicion into confirmation. And yet, even with those advancements, there is an awareness among investigators that not every case will resolve in the same way. That not every mystery will yield to time or technology. That some questions may remain unanswered, not because of lack of effort, but because of the limits of what can be recovered. The Claremont case sits within that tension between what was achieved and what still remains beyond reach. It is both resolved and incomplete. Closed in a legal sense, but open in its emotional and historical resonance. For those who study it, whether professionally or through public interest, it becomes more than a sequence of events. It becomes a reflection on how fragile the boundary is between visibility and invisibility in everyday life. How easily someone can move through a familiar environment without drawing attention. How assumptions about safety can coexist with realities that contradict them. But even with all of that analysis, the case ultimately returns to something simpler. 3 women. Each living a life that mattered long before it intersected with an investigation. Each remembered now not only for how they were taken, but for who they were before that moment. And one man whose actions disrupted not just those lives, but the sense of certainty within an entire community. In the end, what remains is not only the resolution of a crime, but the recognition of everything that cannot be fully resolved. The absence that cannot be restored. The time that cannot be returned. The understanding that justice, while necessary, is not the same as repair. And so the story does not truly end. It settles. It becomes part of the environment it once disrupted, present in memory rather than action, in reflection rather than urgency. And every time it is revisited, it carries the same reminder forward. That behind every case file, every headline, every courtroom transcript, there are lives that existed in full long before they were reduced to a moment of loss. And those lives, in the end, are what endure. There is a final kind of silence that comes after everything has already been said, after every witness has spoken, every report has been filed, every verdict has been delivered. It is not the silence of absence alone, but the silence of something that has been fully witnessed and cannot be unseen again. In the case of Claremont serial killings, that silence settled slowly over Claremont and the wider city of Perth. Life resumed its rhythm, but never in quite the same way as before. The streets filled again, the bars reopened each night, the same crowds moved through the same familiar spaces. Yet beneath that repetition, there was an awareness that had not existed before, a quiet understanding that ordinary places could hold extraordinary darkness without warning. For the families of Sarah Spires, Jane Rimmer, and Kira Glennon, the passage of time did not soften the significance of what had happened. It reshaped it. It turned raw immediacy into memory, and memory into something that must be carried rather than escaped. Each of them continues to exist in the lives of those who loved them, not as headlines or case files, but as fully formed human beings whose absence is still felt in the smallest, most ordinary moments. There are no final answers that can restore what was taken. No conclusion that can reverse the shape of what occurred. Even with conviction, even with legal closure, there remains a boundary that cannot be crossed back over. Justice, in this sense, does not undo the past. It only defines its accountability. The conviction of Bradley Robert Edwards marked the end of uncertainty in a legal framework, but it also marked the beginning of reflection. Not only about the individual responsible, but about the systems, assumptions, and blind spots that allowed such events to remain unresolved for so long. Investigators, forensic experts, and communities were left with a shared understanding that time alone does not solve cases, but that persistence, coupled with evolving technology, can eventually bring clarity where there was once only speculation. The advancement of DNA analysis played a decisive role in transforming fragments of evidence into a coherent picture. What had once been insufficient became, over time, conclusive. This shift did not happen suddenly. It emerged through years of preservation, revisiting, and refinement. It demonstrated that evidence does not lose value simply because it is old, and that cold cases are never truly closed while their material remains intact. But beyond the science and the legal process, there is a more human dimension that persists. The way fear once altered behavior in small, almost invisible ways. The way a city collectively recalibrated its understanding of safety without ever fully acknowledging it at the time. The way nighttime routines shifted, subtly but permanently, after the realization that vulnerability does not always announce itself. These changes do not fade entirely, even when the immediate threat is gone. They become part of collective memory, passed down not through formal instruction, but through lived experience and inherited caution. And yet, despite everything, life continues to assert itself. New generations walk the same streets without knowing the full weight of what happened there, or only knowing it as history rather than lived reality. For them, Claremont is both a place of ordinary life and a place marked by events they did not experience but still indirectly inherit. This coexistence of normality and memory is what defines the aftermath of cases like this. Not a return to innocence, because innocence in the original sense cannot be restored, but a continuation shaped by awareness. The story, when reduced to its most essential form, is simple. 3 women went out into a familiar world and did not return. 1 man was eventually found responsible. The law responded. The community adapted. The families continue to remember. But within that simplicity lies something far more complex. The intersection of chance and choice. The presence of systems that both succeeded and failed. The limits of what can be known at any given moment in time. There is no final image that completes it. No single moment that closes the narrative in a way that feels fully satisfying or entirely resolved. Instead, there is only the accumulation of everything that came before, held together in a structure that remains emotionally unfinished, even if it is legally concluded. And perhaps that is the most honest form a story like this can take. Not one that ends with resolution in every sense, but one that acknowledges the space that remains after resolution has done all it can do. Because what remains, after everything else has been said, is not the case itself. It is the people. The absence they left behind. And the fact that their lives, in all their fullness, existed long before they became part of something larger than themselves. That is what endures. Not the silence that followed, but the memory that refuses to be reduced by it. There is a final reflection that lingers long after the official record of a case has ended, one that does not belong to investigators, courts, or headlines, but to the human mind trying to make sense of what cannot be fully made sense of. In the case of Claremont serial killings, that reflection does not arrive as a conclusion. It arrives as a question that quietly persists beneath everything else that has been said. How does a place like Claremont, so ordinary in its daily rhythm, so familiar in its patterns of nightlife and social gathering, become the backdrop for something so profoundly disruptive? There is no single answer that satisfies that question, because what happened there was not born from the place itself, but from the intersection of timing, opportunity, and a person who moved through that environment without immediate detection. The conviction of Bradley Robert Edwards closed a chapter in the legal sense, but it did not close the emotional or psychological space the case opened within the community. That space remains, not as fear in the same immediate form as before, but as awareness. Awareness that safety is often built on assumptions that feel permanent until they are tested. Awareness that normality is not a guarantee, but a condition that depends on countless unseen variables aligning in a stable way. For the families of Sarah Spires, Jane Rimmer, and Kira Glennon, the passage of time has not diminished the significance of what was lost. Instead, it has layered it with memory, routine, and the ongoing reality of absence. Each of them continues to exist in the stories told about them, in the recollections of those who knew them, and in the absence that shaped everything that followed their disappearance. Time does not erase that presence. It transforms it into something quieter, but no less real. There is a tendency in true crime narratives to search for closure as if it were a destination. A single moment where everything becomes complete, where questions dissolve into certainty. But cases like this resist that structure. Even with conviction, even with forensic confirmation, even with decades of investigation, there remains a space that does not resolve neatly. That space is where human experience continues to live. The evolution of forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, played a decisive role in transforming what was once an unsolved mystery into a solved case. Evidence that had been preserved through years of uncertainty eventually revealed connections that earlier methods could not detect. This progression demonstrates something important about justice itself. It is not always immediate, and it is not always linear. Sometimes it depends on the future catching up to the past. But technology alone does not carry meaning without the human effort that preserves and re-examines what might otherwise be forgotten. The persistence of investigators, the decision not to discard old evidence, the willingness to revisit cases long after they had grown cold, all of these elements contributed to an outcome that might not have been possible otherwise. And yet, even with that success, there is a humility embedded in the process. Because every resolved case also highlights the ones that remain unresolved. Every answer found also underscores the limits of what can still be discovered. In the end, the Claremont case becomes more than a record of crime and investigation. It becomes a reminder of how fragile certainty can be, and how long truth can take to surface when it is buried beneath time, silence, and incomplete information. But it is also, in a quieter way, a reminder of resilience. Not only the resilience of those who investigated it, but of those who lived through it and continued afterward. Families who carried grief forward without allowing it to define every part of their existence. A community that absorbed shock and gradually rebuilt its sense of normal life. A system that learned from its limitations and adapted in response. Nothing about that process is simple. Nothing about it is fully satisfying. But it is real. And perhaps that is the final understanding that remains when everything else has been examined. That justice, memory, loss, and time do not align into a perfect resolution. They coexist. Sometimes uneasily. Sometimes quietly. But always in relation to one another. And in that coexistence, the story of Claremont continues to exist, not as an ending, but as a permanent part of how a place, and the people connected to it understand what it means to live with both certainty and its absence at the same time.